Claudianna, thank you so much for joining me on the briefing today. Look, can we start with the basics? What is Harmony Day?
So, March 21st was labeled Harmony Day in Australia. So, a day to celebrate multiculturalism and inclusivity, inclusion and diversity. And so, like children in schools and people in offices are encouraged to wear orange, bring in like a plate from their country, and have a morning tea or like an afternoon tea and discuss, I guess, and celebrate living in a multicultural and a very harmonious multicultural society. So it's a very warm and fuzzy kind of celebration. However, this celebration is out of step with what the rest of the world marks on March 21st, which is the UN International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is the original intent of this day. And so, in many circles, because there is this kind of difference between the concept of the elimination of racism versus Harmony Day, there are growing calls for this day to change its intent and for it to be, I guess, rebranded or kind of put back in line with what the rest of the world kind of does on this day.
Okay. Look, we will talk about that and the people who want to change it. I did want to ask you, though, because I've heard it's a really interesting story, is how Australia actually decided on celebrating Harmony Day in the first place.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting story that I learned last year, really, as I was a reporter working in multicultural affairs for SBS, for the Special Broadcasting Service. So I had to interview a lot of experts. And I interviewed Professor Andrew Jakubowicz, who is like a professor emeritus of sociology at UTS. And he is like the top expert in Australia that knows about this history. So basically, John Howard, or then Prime Minister John Howard, introduced Harmony Day in 1999. And this happened in response to a government report. So in the late 90s, the government kind of noticed that there was like a lot of incidences of racism and discrimination in Australia, and it commissioned a report to investigate it. There was a study conducted, and the report was called the Eureka Report. And basically what happened is that the people conducting this report, they invited a cross-section of people, from society, white people, First Nations people, migrants, like a really wide cross-section, and people who also didn't speak English as their first language. And they brought them together to kind of investigate what their views on Australian society were, what their views on discrimination were, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so after this study, or as a result of this study, they realized that there was like this really big spectrum of people in society. So you had a lot of people who were like pro-diversity, and then you had at the other end of the spectrum, people who were very hostile to the idea of multiculturalism and immigration and diversity. And they realized another thing, that amongst the people who were pro-diversity, they were really very well equipped to identify racism, what racism was, or in its different forms and in its different manifestations. And they were also very capable of calling out racism. But then on the other end of the spectrum, the people who were more hostile to the idea of multiculturalism, they were unable to recognize racism. And furthermore, they would get very upset, or they would get, I guess, rebuff or reject any suggestion that their views were hostile, or that their views were racist, and that their values and attitudes were against, migrants or multiculturalism. So that was really interesting. But what came about from this Eureka report was that the levels of racism and discrimination in Australia at that point in time were off the charts. And this is kind of like a direct quote from Professor Jakubowicz, who also said that it was so significant that it, and I quote, I remember this word, spooked the government to the point that they buried this report. And it took Professor Jakubowicz about some 15 years to get it released under FOI laws.
Wow. 15 years.
Yeah. But I should go back and tell you more about this report, because what this report then went to investigate is, okay, we have this issue in Australia. So is there one value that will, that we can use
Mm.
to unite the country, that will bring the pro-diversity people on board, but it could also kind of influence those people that were very, I guess, that had very negative views
Mm.
towards multiculturalism. And they came up with the idea of Harmony Day. So harmony was the only, or the idea or the notion that Australia lived in a harmonious multicultural society was really the only notion that more than 50% of those who took part in the report or in the study could agree on. And so hence we had Harmony Day. So it was a complete rebranding because the government thought, okay, we can't present this to the Australian public because it will be rejected.
Mm. Okay. It is an interesting story. You're right. And I suppose before I read your article, I just thought Harmony Day was a nice day to celebrate being harmonious. I didn't understand the context behind the creation of the day. And look, it's something that the Greens want to address. They want Harmony Day to be dumped and replaced by Anti-Racism Week. Of course, it's Harmony Week as well. It's a full
Hmm.
week in the calendar. The Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs says he will not be celebrating March 21st as Harmony Day and is instead recognising it as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is the UN Day. Why do you think the day has started to become controversial?
Green Senator Maureen Faruqi has used very strong language to describe Harmony Day or Harmony Week. She said it's a week of whitewashing. She's described the celebration as tokenistic. She said it's very superficial, and the government in turn has responded by saying, well, we are moving towards a space of having the difficult conversations that need to be had. So in terms of the difference between both, I guess, days or both commemorations. So we have to understand that March 21st, as the Day for Elimination of Racism, has a goal of clearly eliminating racism or working against racism.
Mm.
And actually, every year there's a different theme for this. Now, that is very different to the idea of celebrating multiculturalism and inclusion and diversity,
Yeah.
which of course they're great goals,
Mm.
but they're just different goals. So I think that the Green Senator is just trying to call that out.
Hmm. Look, is Harmony Day tokenistic then, given that it's an opportunity for officers to say, hey, everyone, let's come together, let's share a plate of food from our backgrounds, and let's be inclusive and harmonious together? Does that make it tokenistic, or can it just be what it is, which is a day to acknowledge the diversity we have in Australia?
Well, I guess that is the question that policymakers need to address. But certainly the people who are very involved, or like the experts who work in the advocacy space or in like the diversity advocacy space, I should say, um, do think that more needs to be done.
Hmm.
So people like Senator Faruqi or Professor Andrew Yakubovich, or even people like Luke Pearson from Indigenous X, they have all told me in the past that they do feel it's tokenistic and superficial, and basically they feel that it, because the goals are misaligned, then that is an issue, because it's language does matter
Mm.
in this context. When you're working towards the elimination of racism, that is very different. That means paving the way to having really hard conversations about Australia's history, and about Australia today, and the legacy of Australia's white history today, and how that continues to impact
Mm.
peoples of color and First Nations Australia that live here. So, yeah, there is a distinct difference. And when you think about it from a policy perspective and from a funding perspective, if you have something like Harmony Day or Harmony Week, versus something like Anti-Racism Week, that means that the money that different governments or different organizations or corporations invest If you invest them in Harmony Day, it's okay, let's invest in celebrating something. If you are invested in anti-racism, then we're talking about educational programs or workshops that are specifically tailored to being anti-racist, to eliminating the presence of discrimination and racism in society. So yeah, there's a difference there.
So, what does all of this say about Australia's relationship with racial equality then?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Australia does have it's a country that was founded on the principle of the White Australia policy. And things like the White Australia policy and the stolen generations were happening until very, very recently. So that does have a lasting legacy. And that's just fact. Also in 2020, Australian intelligence services, so ASIO, said that the single biggest domestic threat to Australia was the rise of white supremacist groups. And we've seen in the last few years, like men dressed in black, wearing balaclavas, marching in front of the Victorian Parliament. Earlier this year in Sydney on January 26th, we saw that again. So there is a growing problem.
Mm.
And there are numbers that back this up. So, what is interesting about what I'm about to tell you, and I want to kind of tell you the context before I tell you the numbers,
Hmm.
is that it seems like in Australia, both a harmonious multicultural society exists, but also racism exists. So
Mm.
they coexist.
Hmm.
So we have, for example, the Scanlon Foundation issues every year its annual report on the state of social cohesion
Hmm.
in Australia. And this year or last year in 2023, it found that the levels of cohesion and belonging in Australia were on a 17-year low. So the lowest it has ever been
Hmm.
since the report started. So basically now 48% of Australians now feel that they don't belong, and that's down from 52% a couple of years ago. On the other hand, it does show that there is a very, very high support for multiculturalism and immigration. So higher than 85%. I think it's 89 and 86% support for multiculturalism and immigration in this country. So that aspect is very high.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side of that, it also tells us that people of color do report having experiences of racism and discrimination in various ways and in varying degrees. So these are the numbers. And so basically, social cohesion and the acceptance of immigration, multiculturalism, and the presence of racism, it's a multifactored, multifaceted kind of thing. So Australia, I guess, would need to invest in this. Now, to be fair, the government has said that it's working now on its multicultural framework, which it's going to be released, I guess, in a month's time or so. And it said that this report is to look for the barriers that people, like migrants from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, face. And it's also tasked the Australian Human Rights Commission to developing a national anti-racism strategy, which is expected to be completed in June 2026, so that their efforts being taken into this. But what the experts like Professor Jakubowicz say and Luke Pearson say is that the lack of funding and I guess the way that Harmony Day and Harmony Week was framed for so long has meant that we have lost a full generation of research into racism, of research into discrimination, institutions looking into the problem, and building a society that has high literacy in terms of recognizing and calling out the different types of racism. Because we have very obvious types of racism, like the overt, you know, KKK type of
Mm.
racism that's easy to identify. But what is trickier is identifying and eliminating things like casual racism or systemic racism.
Mm. It is one of those conversations that, as you mentioned, is difficult, but it's clear that it's very important that we have, and why not have it on Harmony Day? Who knows? It might be called something else next year. Claudianna, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.